Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. I'm doing my week 2 weekly wrap up in November. There are 22 books. Most of them are graphic novels and easy to consume though, so I'll tackle those as we go. First up, I read The Age of Precarity, Endless Crisis and the Art of Government by Dario Gentili. This book is a Verso Club book club choice, which they had a deal where you get 50% off for 3 months when you join, and then you get a ton of books. They sent me 2, 3, 4 books per month for the 3-month period of that, and then like 10 ebooks as well, so it's definitely value for money. It's a little bit overwhelming. This book in particular I was excited for, and it did not live up to my expectations. I gave it 3 stars for what it was, but what I thought this was going to be about is a sort of structural analysis of government literally showing how they are in an endless crisis and how they use that specifically to get out of situations to perpetuate the military-industrial complex, etc. It's not that at all. It is about the etymology or the genealogy, as it describes in the book, of precarity, and sort of putting that under a Foucault analysis, which is kind of interesting, kind of not. It's an interesting way to sort of show where the word is at, where it came from, how the left relates to it, and, you know, its evolution. But I think it would be more interesting to look at the word crisis specifically in government, as it is certainly telegraphed in this book, in my opinion. A book that didn't disappoint me from the Verso book club at all, though, was Investigative Aesthetics, which I tapped the shit out of vertically even when I was quoting in my video. So I do have a 20-minute video on this already. Came out 2 days ago, something like that. So go to that if you want specifics, but this book is specifically about reclaiming the sort of terminology, or what is known in the commons of politics and truth, as it says on the cover, about the separate words investigation and aesthetics. And it sort of refocuses them for the modern times, and specifically under an investigation forming a counter-narrative to what states usually provide, usually in the case of state violence. So people deploying specific sense-making, as it's defined in the book, tools, usually through technology, and sort of the plurality of humans adding to specific events, i.e. people on cameras recording events that are taking place, George Floyd, for instance, or people deploying actual like high resolution and other specific technologies like sniffing technologies and stuff like that at terrorist sites, at state violence sites, and seeing exactly what is not specifically maybe true, but analyzing it from the point of view that the state is providing a narrative that needs to be countered. It's a fascinating book. I thought it was very interesting. I gave it only 4 stars because it is coached in an accessible language for the most part, which is sort of laughable when you think about it, because the object of the book is to reclassify terms for like the popular commons, so the public. So why would you coach it in language that is inaccessible? It's very academically minded. The blurb on the back makes, you know, only some sense if you're very familiar with specific terminology. So in that regard, I think it fails, but otherwise it's very fascinating, especially as it pertains to aesthetics. And check out my video for the sort of main thrust of the book and the most interesting points I think it had to say. Next, I read The Book of Form and Emptiness, which I thought was really great, by Ruth Ozeki. I gave this book 5 stars. I loved it. It's not going to be for everybody though, because it is sort of a meandering, plotless book. It is about a young Japanese American with a mother who is now single. They're dealing with the death of the father, and Benny O, the protagonist, basically, it jumps between Benny O and his mother as well, but he's sort of the central figure. He is neurodivergent. He might be mentally ill. We're not too sure. He thinks that he can speak to inanimate objects, and it sort of is about who gets to ascribe agency in the lives of particular people. For instance, there's a social worker who sort of dictates the lives that they have by sort of commanding the mother to meet certain obligations and standards. And Benny doesn't really have control of his life because he is being dictated to by like mental health professionals that don't really know who he is or treat him in a very like humane manner. They find it difficult to believe him about certain things, and then so ascribe a label of falsity on like absolutely everything that he says. And so there's some really interesting structural things being talked about, or systemic things. And also it's postmodern, or maybe post-postmodern, in the sense that one of the inanimate objects that he speaks to is the book itself, which is the thing we're consuming diegetically within the book. And it has its own chapters where it speaks to the reader, breaking the fourth wall. But then there's tension within the narrative of having to conform to storytelling tropes and form and a bunch of other things. So it's a very fascinating book. I have a video coming out on it soon. I then read Embers, One Ojibway's Meditations by Richard Wagamese. This is a 3-star read for me. It's all about spirituality, which is always sort of like a short story mixed bag for me. Some things I find very enlightening and interesting. Other things always seem very like overly simplistic or too idealistic for me. And his shtick in it's that he asks an elder a specific question, they give him an answer he doesn't understand, then they clarify it in simplistic terms, and then it moves on, and it gets kind of grating and annoying. Also, it doesn't say if that is actually what he did. Like, is this just a structure of storytelling, or is all of those parts actually him asking elders, and that is their actual reply, ostensibly at least coached in editing and making it sort of formatted structurally for a book. That was kind of unclear and strange. I then read The Spoils of War, Power, Profit, and the American War Machine by Andrew Cockburn. This is another verso book, which I tapped quite a bit of. This is a great companion piece. It might have even been the same month, I'm not sure, of Investigative Aesthetics, because it sort of is a real-world application of investigative aesthetics, even though it doesn't really codify or codify it if you're in Britain. It is a series of essays that Cockburn has written. So some of the essays are quite a while ago. I'm pretty sure it more or less proceeds chronologically, and is roughly grouped in sort of specific critiques of the military-industrial complex. It definitely paints them as completely incompetent, as a grifter, money-making machine, doesn't serve the humane or ethics that it should, as something that plays with people's actual lives, American lives, that ostensibly cares about, and it's damning in many cases. However, when it gets to Afghanistan, most of this is retread ground, unless you are, I don't know, hiding under a rock and you didn't know that the CIA had been intervening in Afghanistan for some time, arming the militias there, essentially creating and training the Taliban to combat Russia, and then it bit them in the ass, obviously, when they decided to enter it again. Also, CIA funding slush money for drugs, stuff like that is in here, and so it would be really elucidating if that wasn't already sort of present in the general intellect. But knowing America, maybe it isn't present in the general intellect, and so maybe it would be sort of incendiary even still down there. Overall, a good book. He's a really good writer. It's sort of like conversational. It's very accessible in the opposite manner of investigative aesthetics. If you've seen my book palette tag, it comes from Sweetbitter. I saw it on TV. This is by Stephanie Danler, and it was really big a long time ago. It's got quite a lot of books on Goodreads, like 60,000 votes or ratings or whatever. I preferred the show. All of the bits that were very interesting were present in the show. It reworked some queer characters in much better ways. The overall narrative structure is better. She's not in kind of whining white girl in the show. But the book is still quite interesting. One of my favorite characters, Simone, a waitress in it, who talks about the palate, about wine, about food, and a bunch of other things, is present and still really well realized in the book. And that's sort of why I picked it up used and consumed it anyway. But definitely the show does basically everything better, in my opinion. So it ended up being a 3-star read for me, roughly meeting my expectations, but no more. Then I read this really short graphic novel. This is If I Go Missing by Brianna, Jonnie. I gave this 5 stars because it is excellent at what it does. This talks about an issue in Canada, Indigenous women going missing, and the police not treating it as white people do. It graphically illustrates specific parts of a nonfiction letter that was sent to the Winnipeg Police Department by a real-life Indigenous girl. I think she even went missing. I'm not too sure on that, but essentially it's a letter that was begging the police to start taking Indigenous women like her. I think she was underage at the time, like 16, 17 or something. And even her watching press conferences on missing people, she was able to easily ascertain that the police were treating Indigenous women as a low priority and being racist about it. They characterized the missing people or the victims in very different terms. And so there's this heart-wrenching part in it where she says, if I go missing, just know that I did not do it on purpose. Please come looking for me. Please find me. And it even says, don't treat me like an Indigenous person if I go missing, which is just shattering, basically. In the back, there's resources, the actual letter. It's short, it's punchy, the graphic. I'm no artist and I can't really judge art in a meaningful way. It seemed like it did the trick. It was very affecting for me, at least. And I think it's like exactly perfect to put that in the hands of white people to make them like stop being so disaffected and bring the events into the forefront of the cultural consciousness. This is an older book. This was published 2 years ago, and when it was published, it did start a new conversation around it. So next, I read The Case of the Missing Men, Hobtown Mystery Stories #1 by Chris Burton. This is a Canadian graphic novel, which is all black and white and simple panels and whatnot. It's very strange. It's sort of surrealistic. People liken it to David Lynch, sort of like Twin Peaks vibe. There's weird stuff happening, and it's like Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Scooby-Doo type situations where they're trying to figure it out, except in more realistic terms and just more serious, essentially. I actually didn't like this book very much, though. I gave it 2 stars because it didn't meet my expectations. There was a little bit of actual racism from both sides. So at first I thought it was trying to communicate racism about the Newfoundland town that it is set in, and that kind of makes sense, but then the protagonists themselves are also being racist. There's no dialogue specifically about that, so it seems more like they completely missed the mark that they were even reproducing those harmful tropes. It takes a sort of left turn from sort of hyper-realistic-ish to the more fantastical, which I wasn't a fan of. And I just didn't like any of the characters. And as it went on, I liked it less and less. Next, I read Housemaid of Dawn by N. Scott Momaday via audio, which was excellent. It was well narrated. It's very hard to articulate my thoughts on this. I thought it was very interesting. It centers on a particular character, kind of similar to Faulkner or Astra recently I did a review on, where each chapter we are sort of not getting the perspective of the main character. It's from other people's lenses, other people's eyes, so we never get their full sort of experience on a particular thing. But to great effect for this, because it shows sort of the marginalization, the non-agency that the character has in their own life. It is beautifully poetic a lot of the time, even though it is rather simplistic. It's very economical and precise in its deployment of diction. I thought it was great. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read the Sunshine Girl in Unexpected Life by Juliana Margulies. She is an actress that I've seen since ER, so I followed her. I love The Good Wife. I love The Good Fight. But I found her narration, of course, is quite good. She's an actress. Her life, though, is fairly generic cookie cutter memoir type stuff. Or maybe I've just consumed so many celebrity memoirs that it's all sort of like bleeding and running together. She reads everything in a very disaffected voice, so it's hard to feel bad for her on certain things. And it's mostly just about her having a complicated relationship with her parents around a divorce and how that sort of shaped her relationships with men in general. She's usually fine with a sort of amount of toxic masculinity going in and her being sort of minimized and diminished. And then of course she reaches a point where that's not the case and she overcomes it. And she goes from waitress to actress in ER, where she initially didn't have a full contract but then did get it. Overall, I gave it 2 stars. I didn't like it. More of it is a miss than a hit for me. It does at least have the structural elements of a memoir that I quite like, where there's a through line, but it again just felt more disaffecting than anything else. Next, I read Land, Water, Sky by Katlia. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, unfortunately. If anyone finds an article on how to pronounce the name correctly, I'd be interested in that. I searched on YouTube, as I try to do now, for correct pronunciations, people like introducing the people or talking about the book. Nothing came up in YouTube, but maybe I just missed it somehow. Anyway, this is a book by a Dene woman, if I'm not mistaken. It traces the sort of mythology of a particular story the Dene have told for a very long time, in which there's a sort of like physical manifestation of evil that negotiates the world and can shapeshift. And it takes place before colonization occurs to 2030, skipping ahead in time linearly. It never generally focuses on the same character, and sometimes you don't know how it fits into this overall story, but eventually by the last story it all kind of connects together in a pretty satisfying way. I gave it 4 stars. I quite liked it. It has some really interesting elements. The prose are uneven, but range from really great to just fine. Like it isn't something you notice, it just goes through you, which is better than noticing that it's bad, especially for a debut. It's generally hard to get attached to a specific character, because once you kind of get a grip on the format, you know that it'll be like, 30-40 pages and you'll be moving on. And generally it's more about world building and tracing the plot through this through line, which I quite liked, but if they had managed to also do some great characterization, it would have easily been a 5-star read from me. On the back it says, it gives a unique perspective on what the world might look like today if indigenous legends walked among us, disguised as humans. But it actually isn't really about that as far as I can tell. It doesn't trace an alternate history. It presupposes that the evil that walks around, that originates in the sort of indigenous lands and haunts the indigenous people, is sort of synonymous with white people in some ways, which I think is even more interesting, but is a mischaracterization of what the book is actually trying to do on the back cover, which is strange. Next, I tried to read Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood on audio. This is a YA book that said it was sort of a retelling of Jane Eyre, but not really, from an Ethiopian standpoint, if I remember correctly. And so that was quite interesting to me, but the narrator was quite flat, the characters were quite flat, and it was really hard to get invested in it, so I ended up DNFing it at 25%-ish. It just never got off the ground for me. I was not interested in anything that was happening. Next, I read Red by Michael, I'm not sure if I could pronounce that correctly, Yagonas. This is a really cool graphic novel that uses the Haida style of manga, where it is reproducing a sort of mythological tale that is indigenous, but using really interesting framing techniques with brushes. Hopefully I got some pictures and can put it up. The characters and the art are just breathtaking. The colors are really cool. It is very frenetic and a very fast read, but it's also a little bit confusing in its frenetic pacing. And then at the end, it kind of comes together because the author states that he encourages you to wreck the book, damage it, in the sense of ripping out all the pages and then placing them on the ground. And I think it said that you actually need 2 copies to do it properly. But once it does, it forms like a huge sort of mosaic or a tableau where you get like the full story, essentially. There's a lot more sort of like elucidation apparently about it. There's a picture in the back of how to arrange it, and it looks like it would be very cool. I gave it 4 stars because obviously it's not accessible for most people to be able to do that. You also have to ruin 2 copies of the book in order to do it. But I think it would be really cool to actually like assemble the whole thing and then have it as like an art piece or something on the wall, because it would be so wide that you could just step back and consume it that way. And maybe it was even shown in a gallery in that way. I wouldn't be surprised. But you can see the brush strokes constructing alternate versions of paneling as all of those pieces come together, which is just fascinating and very cool. Next, I read After Parties by Anthony So. I gave this 4 stars. I thought it was pretty great. Some stories are, hits, some stories are missed, just like all short story collections are for me, except for one. And this sort of traces the intergenerational trauma of Cambodians, how they have kind of internalized the trauma, how they react to it, what that does to their particular relationships, how they negotiate life. It was just fascinating in a lot of respects. The writing is pretty sparse and economical. I didn't ever come away from a passage in particular thinking it was like particularly poetic or sort of stand out, but there are specific interactions that are characterized in almost like a Rooney-esque way, where you get a lot of subtleties about these people and why that specific interaction is playing out how it is, even though it might be unbeknownst to either of those characters, which I thought was really great. So next I read Moonshots Volume 1, 2, 3. These are graphic novels that I kickstarted like years ago or something. They delivered the PDFs to everybody, and then I sort of forgot about it because you had to read it on a computer. But this is an all-Canadian team, or at least the editors are, and a lot of the contributors are. All 3 volumes are quite good. The first one is not that great to read digitally because they didn't export it quite well, or it was downsampled so much that you can kind of see the DPI is quite low, and it's like just annoying to consume something that was exported incorrectly and not crisp on a screen. But the stories also were like pretty uneven. I take the collection to mean something like you learn a little bit about Indigenous stories, and then also specifically find content creators or illustrators or what have you that are interesting to you, and then you get to find out about them, follow them, and see more of their art. And so for that, it's a resounding success. The first and third issues I gave 3 stars. They fulfill their purpose, and as each volume comes out, the quality digitally gets better as well, which is nice. The third one was perfect, for instance. The second one was getting there, but the second one is super standout. I give it 5 stars. All of the stories, except for 2, were amazing, like actual 5-star reads. The art was amazing, and again, I found a couple artists that I just want to read more graphic novels from them because it looked amazing. Then I read another Kickstarter one that I had forgotten about because it was in my same folder. Kugali Anthology Volume 1 Raki Edition from Jessonos Lamy. This has 3 different stories, 3 issues from each of them compiled into 1 volume. And the first and third stories I thought were fine. The illustration was, I would say, subpar. And it was very like masculine comics in the sense of like, I don't know, like He-Man or whatever, like fighting and lots of violence and stuff like that, and I didn't really care about it. But the middle one with the artwork that should be on display was really cool. It's Afro-punk science fiction, I think is what they described it as. And the artwork was amazing. It has a really cool storyline that is a little bit more subversive of specific tropes, and it incorporates African mythology, even with like child soldiers and stuff like that. So I wish that more of this was coming. I think another volume is coming with that particular storyline, and I would get it just for that. I tried looking for it single issue wise, and it didn't seem to be available on his Gumroad or on Comixology, so I'm wondering kind of what's up with that, but I would definitely give that creator more of my time. Next, I read a book that is from Joshua Whitehead, who you might know from Johnny Appleseed now. This is his first work, though, Full Metal Indigiqueer. This book is so smart on so many different levels. I gave it 4 stars because sometimes it's not quite cohesive. Hopefully I can articulate what makes this so interesting for a poetry collection. First of all, it is cyberpunk, but also nonfiction, also poetry. It's maybe the most intersectional work that I can think of, certainly for cyberpunk, although there is another cyberpunk poetry collection by Misha, who did the first Indigenous cyberpunk book that I know of anyway, Red Spider, White Web. But this book is essentially Whitehead breaking down his own identity through the lens of cyberpunk, by him starting up a birthing sequence at the beginning, Ghost in the Shell, a la Ghost in the Shell type thing. He sort of makes the reader think that he has initiated a specific program, which is his identity, and then each poem is a program that he is running, and there's a command prompt that shows sort of what it is. So it might be like decolonizing Whitman, and then it will have like a poetry experience, basically. It could be just normal poetics listed in verse, or it could be all over the page. It could have different symbols. It could have leet speak. It could have visuals in it. But it talks about a specific subject, breaks it down, and then it sort of shows how it relates to his specific identity, and then it moves on. So the next poem will be another sort of initialization of a program, and it's always like looking at it through a queer lens, through a two-spirit lens, through a gay man's lens, through an indigenous lens. So as I said, incredibly intersectional, incredibly interesting. It's also sort of a memoir. It's also sort of autofiction, and sometimes it's very unconventional, I think. And at the end, what's really cool is that he has a glossary for each sort of program, and it has references to exactly what he has cited in it. So if it's a Whitman or Shakespeare, then it will have like specific references to The Tempest or whatever. And then you can kind of see how he has approached it from that lens and decolonized it for his own identity. And the way that it isn't cohesive sometimes is that there are some poems that aren't those programs, and I struggled somewhat to see what their place was in it other than just him ascribing meaning to his identity through that specific poem. It didn't fit the actual like cohesive narrative that he had formed previously, and so it felt a little jarring coming out of it. But otherwise, it's amazing. I don't know much about poetry. I found it very accessible. Sometimes it was very lyrical. You could kind of hear the beat, essentially, when he was speaking. Other times, it's like more obtuse. It always fit the theme. I thought it was great. Next, I read We Jane by Amy Wall. I'll have a video out on this because it's a Giller Prize long-listed book. I gave it 4 stars. It's very strange. It's about two friends who move back to Newfoundland when sort of like nothing's really panning out for them elsewhere. They fall into sort of similar self-destructive patterns. Their marginalization, their malaise is predominant. It's a very sad book. It's also about abortion rights, so it's a feminist text as well. It's got a very strange voice that is at once very poetic, sometimes disaffected, and it sort of tries to drop you in the feeling of their own malaise, which I thought was pretty bold, and I liked it because I like sad stuff. Next, I read You Are Eating an Orange, You Are Naked by Sean King. This I gave 3 stars. I didn't like it as much as other people. It is a very strange book where is it autofiction? Is it memoir? Is it a novel? Who knows? He's sort of playing around with structure and form, and he is more or less tracing the tension between what happens between him and his girlfriend that goes unnamed. She is the you in the story. Sometimes he's you as well, though. But she is the one who is eating an orange and she is naked. And he's always sort of internalizing, or he's always externalizing his interiority via the prose. But the thing that I don't like about it, because usually I love that type of framing, and his prose are generally pretty good. The thing I didn't like is he uses a lot of mass media, pop culture references as shorthand to do work that the actual structure of the book should be doing. But when you sit with it and really think about it, it comes away as quite shallow because you haven't really been told much about the actual character. The characterization hasn't really been done. And in some cases, the shorthand of specific references such as Kafka are not dived in so deeply so that it feels even more shallow, and it isn't as well articulated as the loss in translation sections. And it's also, obviously quite meandering, obviously very self-aware, preoccupied with itself. At one point, he breaks the fourth wall and says he's having trouble finishing the chapter, and this is why he's writing the chapter to finish it and all this other kind of stuff. So it's a little bit of a mess in my opinion. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. The audio was well narrated. It was definitely gripping. It didn't get boring even when it was meandering. It's just that the more that I sat with it, the more shallow it felt. And then the last thing that I consumed was Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. I gave this 3 stars. I had immense expectations for this. I've had like 25 people tell me that this was excellent, so it kind of makes sense that it only met my expectations. I thought externalizing grief into a sort of anthropomorphized pro is interesting, but it also is ironically quite fleeting. I empathized with the situations, but I couldn't relate to them. And so I felt a little bit alienated, but I still enjoyed it, still gave it 3 stars. And that's it. But I will go into what I am currently reading. Usually I have everything done, but I have a couple, I haven't finished The Years yet, for instance, and this is incredible so far. I'm not very far into it, but I absolutely love this structure. I think it's fantastic. It might well be in my top 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever I decide to do, because it's just incredible. She examines her life through looking at photographs and really interrogating her feelings, her thoughts, very specific situations to situate those in a sort of time capsule-like narrative. And so it's the most engrossing memoir. It has more substance. It feels more real than most memoirs because it's about feelings and thoughts and the current moment in the past. So it feels like it can be true versus most memoirs where they just sort of fill in a lot of gaps with a lot of fiction, and it feels like fiction when you're reading it. This feels more what an actual memoir is, basically, to me, and more substantive, like I said. I think Sina might be having a buddy read of this in the future, she had mentioned, so I would definitely 100% read this again if I can horn myself into that or something. And I think that would be interesting to reread it just because of the properties of the book related to memory, and having my own memory of that experience and then rereading it and correlating it to a new experience. That would be interesting. And then I'm also part of the buddy read for Cavalier and Clay, which we're 25% into, and I'm quite enjoying. Not that much has happened, but I'm really enjoying the prose and the setup so far. There's an iconic sort of, I don't know, throwback, basically, where one of the characters is punching Hitler, which reminds me of the Cap moment in Marvel. It has some interesting interplay for people who are aware of the in-groups of comics and the intricacies of its own history versus the fictional reality of what these creators are going through. So that's been fun. And I'd love to know what you're reading. Hit me up in the comments, let me know, and I will see you next video.